So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kate Tsurkan. I'm the editor-in-chief of Epophany magazine, and I welcome you all to this event on literature and war. Today it's a very sad milestone. It's the 100th day of war in Ukraine, in my Ukraine, and it's really hard to imagine that it's been going on for this long. But I hope that we can find some good ways to come forward from tragedy during this conversation. Why I wanted to bring three very interesting authors together today. We have with us Oksana Lutsyshyna from Ukraine, Samar Yazbek from Syria, and Aleksandar Hemon from Bosnia. All three of them incredible writers. You're probably familiar with their work, and that's why you're here. So I think they don't need that much of an introduction. But why I brought these three very different writers together. One of the things that has kind of shocked me in terms of public discourse is people talking about the coverage that Ukrainians got, almost as if it's too much. And I think it's fair to say that war never gets enough coverage. Genocide never gets enough coverage. And what's happening in Ukraine, it's not the first war in this world, and sadly, it will not be the last. But I wanted to put Ukrainian author in conversation with a writer from Syria, a writer from Bosnia, who are familiar with this kind of conflict, who can engage each other in conversation and perhaps find some kind of solidarity and to explore together the power of literature during such terrible times. The limits of literature, perhaps. And with that being said, I want to say welcome Samar, Aleksandar, and Oksana. Thank you for coming, for being with us tonight. My first question, it's about writing and reading. I am generally wondering, when you live through war now in the past, in general, how are you able to write, to read? Because I personally, I had very, romantic notions of being able to read all the books I've missed out on in the bomb shelter when I'm sitting there for several hours on end. And to be honest with you, I'm not reading as much as I would like. Writing, but not reading as much. So I want to start with Oksana. How are you, as a writer, able to create and to read and consume literature during wartime?
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you everyone for being here with us. Well, I have to say, since the war started, I have not really written all that much, if anything at all. It just happens. I mean, something like this happened to me in 2014 when the war in Donbass just started. And when it suddenly was clear that everything changed meaning, that all the metaphors changed meaning, we used to write about broken hearts and, stuff like that. And suddenly it became not a symbol, but a reality to some people. So you kind of have to redefine yourself each time. And I guess in some ways I could say reading is also in this sense redefined. And whenever I now read about war, for example, in the book, that would have a completely different effect on me. If it used to be, something that happened in the past, perhaps like an experience of World War II, now it becomes much more
around front.
Guys, please turn off your microphones.
And if I were to make connections to my fellow speakers today, I would say that I connect with their work differently now. So, for example, when I was reading, the memoir Crossing by Samar, it was, this pictures of devastation now affected me so much that I had to put the book away many times. And when I were to read Aleksandar Hemon, it would be this syndrome of a person who now knows what war is. It's a certain view of the world that you just do not relate to directly until you actually feel it.
It's a really good point. I was talking to one Ukrainian writer recently who said all this literature does not prepare you for war, even though you feel such deep emotions. Once you experience it yourself, those books cannot capture your own experience. Aleksandar, I was wondering if you could share with us your thoughts on how you read and write experiencing war.
Well, my first experience of war was the war in Bosnia about 30 years ago, but I also did not experience it directly because I was in the United States at the time and still am. So it required imagination. It was also the time in the 90s before Twitter and, you know, all the social media and the ability to pretty much live watch the war. So in many ways, war was very, very far away, but also was deep inside me because my family was there, my friends were there, and my city, my country was there. And so there was this presence of war that was in some ways, how would I put it, not quite spiritual, but it was not physical, that changed the meaning of everything wherever I looked. And that included literature. And so at some point 30 years ago, I started reading a lot, partly so as to acquire enough English to write in English, but also because I had this profound need to reevaluate everything in the light of war, the fact of war, because everything changes meaning. Even if I was not directly affected, I can only imagine how a meaning of a book or a poem is changed if you're reading it in a bomb shelter while shells are falling, right? I mean, I've spoken and talked to my friends in Sarajevo who wrote books on the siege, and the fragmentariness of experience that required some kind of change in form to contain that fragmentary reality that they lived through. And this time, and I was deeply affected by the war in Ukraine in many ways because it activated my PTSD and everyone else I know, all of the Bosnians, because of the sheer brutality of it, which was of course not the first time, particularly Russian brutality in Syria, it was obvious. But also because I have personal connection to Ukraine. My family on my father's side is Ukrainian speaking, although they were all born in Bosnia. And so it changed the way I experienced everything, and this is on top of all the other catastrophes that we have been going through or living through over the past couple of weeks. So my response was a kind of hypomania. I started writing more and reading more and making music more, and then it is not a healthy response necessarily, but I think this is, I don't want to talk about it myself, what it symptomizes, I think, is this need to connect with other people, directly or indirectly, to enter a domain of some kind of shared experience. Obviously cannot be shared because I am not being shot at as people or shelled as people in Kiev or Kharkiv or anywhere in Ukraine might be. But there was this need to be part of a, I suppose, human community of some kind, as against people who are trying to devastate such a community. So it's sort of feeble, weak, conceptual solidarity, I suppose.
Yeah, I understand this. I mean, both you and Oksana are in the US watching war from afar, but in some ways, I am in Chernivtsi, in the west of Ukraine, and we're the only region that hasn't been hit by a missile strike in all of Ukraine. So so in many ways, I feel like I'm experiencing war, but I'm not experiencing war, and that's probably why I felt a need to write, to, as you say, make this desperate need for a connection with people. Samar, so you have more of a direct connection with war. Can you tell us what your experience has been like, writing, reading? What has it been like for you since the war broke out in Syria several years ago?
Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone here. I will speak in Arabic, my language favorite. So it was very different for me. يعني أنا الحقيقة وقفت القراءة بداية الثورة السورية كان بال2011 وكنت بالشارع. تغيرت شكل كتابتي من الكتابة الروائية إلى الكتابة التوثيقية اليومية عما يحصل في بداية الثورة السورية.
when the war started in Syria, I stopped reading and
when the
writing.
revolution,
When I was
when the
right,
revolution.
the revolution. I apologize. It's not the war. It's a revolution. I noticed that my writing changed from writing literature to documenting daily events that were taking place on the streets in Damascus, I believe.
Yes.
Okay.
فأنا تغيرت، كانت علاقتي بالكتابة انتقلت من الروائية للكتابة التوثيقية اليومية بالمظاهرات، كانت كتابة عن العنف. فأول سنتين كنت دائما أكتب بشكل توثيقي، وانقطعت عن كتابة الرواية والقراءة. كانت كتابة يومية عن العنف وعن القتل وعن المجازر الحاصلة.
My first 2 years after the revolution started, I was writing daily in documentation kind of style, especially what was happening from killing and violence on daily basis in Syria, and that took away my writing in literature in general.
والحقيقة استمر هالشيء 4-5 سنوات. توقفت عن كتابة الأدب وعن القراءة، وكنت أصدر الكتب وأكتب المقالات بعدة جرائد، لأني أيضا عدت لخط الجبهة وكان عنيف جدا. فلم أقدر، كانت علاقتي بالكتابة الروائية مقطوعة، وانتقلت لشكل من أشكال كتابة الصحافة، وكنت كمراسلة حربية تقريبا.
So my writing changed from writing and reading literature to almost a war reporter who would be reporting on war, and that took about 4 or 5 years that I couldn't, or I did not get the chance to read or write in my usual style, and I almost became a war reporter.
حقيقة لاحقا بعد ما حصل بسوريا، ولأنه الحرب كانت، الثورة تحولت لحرب، صرت أتبع كل كتاب في أنحاء العالم عمن كتبوا على الحرب، فكنت أقرأ بكثرة وبنهم روايات ومقالات عن كل ما يحصل في العالم، كل حروب الحاصلة في العالم.
Okay, so when the revolution started to look like a war or transitioned into a war, I started reading other authors who wrote about wars, other novels, other reports, even newspapers from all around the world about what writing about the war is like.
بالنسبة لي الكتابة بالحرب، بالنسبة لي أنا ما زلت مؤمنة إنه ما لازم نوقف موقف حيادي تجاه الحروب، لازم نفضح جرائم الحرب، ولازم تكون كتابتنا ملتزمة بالضحايا اللي بيوقعوا أثناء هذه الحروب.
I still believe that as authors, we should not be neutral when we see war or when we witness war. We have a role to expose everything that is going on in these wars away from what the media is showing.
And to be inside with the victim.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You make a really great point, Samar, which I've heard a lot from Ukrainian writers who they're fiction writers, poetry writers. For example, there is the poet Yulia Ilucha in Kharkiv, where they are being shot at daily. And she had 2 novels and children's books that were supposed to come out this spring. And no, they are not published. And she said in an interview recently that she became a war correspondent, as you said, that this is the role of writers, not to write poetry for now, but to write, to share stories of victims. And the Ukrainian writer Aleksandar Hemon, he and his wife were in Chernivtsi, and his wife was collecting stories from the many refugees. We have 80,000 refugees in Chernivtsi, the smallest oblast in all of Ukraine. and we have 80,000 people who came here. It's crazy. So this wife of Aleksandar Hemon, another very famous writer, was collecting all of these stories of survivors from Mariupol, Kherson, Kharkiv, everywhere. So yeah, I agree that this role of the writer can be very useful even in wartime to forge solidarity, as we said, and to help give voice to victims who do not always have the right to speak. Before I pass along to Askold the next question, I wanted to ask on the topic of reading. Did any of you ever, did your relationship to certain writers change during wartime? I mean, for me personally, as Russia is invading my country, it became very difficult for me to read Russian writers for obvious reasons, but especially when I heard a lot of Russian liberals who are ostensibly anti-Putin. In the West, we assume that instantly means that they are on our side, and it's not always the case. And they say, Pushkin is not Putin. It's a very common phrase. Pushkin is not Putin. But if you are familiar with the work of Pushkin, I mean, he wrote a poem Poltava where he desecrates Ivan Mazepa, a hero of Ukrainian history who stood up to the Tsar. And he, in his journals, when Pushkin traveled to Kharkiv, said that the university is not worth a restaurant in Kursk, I think. So it's been quite difficult for me personally to engage with a literature which, growing up in America, I was told is this great literature, which living in Ukraine became a literature of oppression. And if you read it deeply, you are very familiar with the view that Russians have had for years of Ukrainians. So this is a more obvious example, but it's open question to all three of you, whoever would like to answer. How has your how has war changed your relationship to certain writers that you read in the past?
Well, I can say something about that because in some ways I'm going to that the second time. Because the presence of war changes the structure of reality, and that includes the constructed realities, in fact, like literature, and also literature, books, writers, they assume a different space and a different structure of reality, as it were. And so it's one thing to read, a book from the 19th century when there's no war, and you think, oh, people were just, didn't know things that they should have known back then. And so you read that, and so obviously everyone has a threshold of what is acceptable even from the old books. But then, if the structure of reality is changed so as to become organized, as it were, around Russian or Serbian imperialism, then one sees signs of Russian or Serbian imperialism or colonialism or just aggression in places where, not that they were not there before, it's that it was less urgent to pay attention to that. In other words, one becomes sensitized to all those signals that could be noise in peacetime, in a time where one can think of a culture and reading as sort of leisurely activity, right? Once it becomes an existential necessity, it also becomes a trove of knowledge that led to the situation, a trove of signals, as it were, that led to the present situation. I was reading, by the way, just with my students, and one of the students brought in the story, The Beauty is by Chekhov, right? Yeah. Innocent, it's about seemingly. But in the story, it's a very short story, it's a little Russian, it's a kind of a slur for Ukrainian, but also the story is organized around this difference between the Russian beauty and Armenian beauty, because the narrator sees a beautiful Armenian girl in part one and sees a beautiful Russian girl in part two. And out of this, a kind of essentialism arises, right? How the Russian beauty has this special quality, and how Armenian beauty is, it's all well and nice to look at, but it's remote, and this is a classic example of what we would call Orientalism, exoticizing the other. And I was sensitized to all that because of the war, and I have to say I hadn't read the Chekhov story before, Chekhov I love, some stories probably still, but it's hard not to see the present moment in the old stories. And I don't think we should suspend the present knowledge when we read old books, right? Because we live in history, and history is an active thing, and my mind and consciousness are subject to history, and I think it is okay to change your mind. and as a culture, but also as a person. And so right now I have no need to read Russian literature, partly because I don't want to understand how it came to this, because I think I know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you make a good point. I mean, as a student of French literature, 19th century, I really loved Honoré de Balzac. And I discovered his travelogues in Ukraine, which was then part of Russian Empire. And I mean, Balzac, we all know, was a monarchist. He was kind of, I don't want to say like Trump, but kind of like a guy who was acting like very like the working class, but trying to be part of this upper class. Everyone said he was very loud, kind of disheveled and strange, but he wanted to hang out with French aristocracy. But Balzac, in his travelogues, had a very kind of imperial colonialist view of Ukrainians. He didn't look at them as separate people from Russians. He thought of them as happy slaves. So it, of course, I don't want to ban Balzac. In the words of Yuri Andrukhovich, great Ukrainian writer, who said, if we are people of literature, we can't ban language, we can't ban books, but we can, you know, as Aleksandar said, look at them in a new way and understand them with more developed eyes, and to understand what's wrong with some of this text and worldviews. Oksana, Samar, I was wondering if either of you had thoughts on this.
Yes, I may continue, and I actually know exactly the word that Chekhov uses for denoting a Ukrainian, malaros. It's like Malorossia was Little Russia. That was the name for Ukraine that kind of existed in this imperial Russian. And actually, I've seen textbooks of linguistics that the fin de siècle, the previous fin de siècle, that had Russian, Malorossia, Belarusia, which is Belarus actually in Belarusian. So yeah, so I remember that I stumbled upon that word as a child, and I was not sure what that meant. Came to my parents like, what is Malaros? And my parents were so embarrassed they didn't even want to tell me somehow, because they would have to then launch into this whole, you know, colonial, post-colonial kind of conversation, which was dangerous under the Soviet Union. And yeah, so I cannot say that I feel similar, exactly the same towards all Russian literature at this point, but towards some authors I definitely do. So it so happens that Russian literature has been equated with universal values for so long. So kind of like, you know, we don't see them situated, you don't see these works necessarily situated in history always, but we kind of see them as symbols, you know, it's like Anna Karenina is not a woman from an aristocratic family, unhappily married, but it's a symbol of love itself. So I think that's been this hard work that we are doing now, kind of reevaluating it and seeing it just as, you know, something that was born out of a particular time period and something that cannot claim to have this universal value. And yeah, and I actually have been drawn lately to a lot of documentary writings and readings, even sometimes social media. I know it's not literature, but a lot of my friends who are writers, they literally just post the stories they heard and they witnessed. And so it's kind of like war resists having one narrative, you know, it's not a novel, it's just these snapshots. And actually, I was rereading, as I mentioned, the book by Samar, The Crossing, and that's kind of what she says there. Is my impression that she just writes down these stories that are snapshots, but it's just so devastating that I don't know how to put them into a narrative. It's a very traumatizing read, and I mean that particular book and any book of this kind, and even social media pieces by my friends, but I don't know how else to start to process all this.
Yes, yes. Samar, maybe you would like to join in.
Yes, يعني just I want to say something. I can answer you. يعني صعب كتير جاوب على هيك سؤال بدون ما احس انه مش عميق كفايه بالحديث عن النقطه الكثير مهمه.
it is not easy for me to answer this question, as I feel that it is not deep enough to have knowledge of this topic.
لانه حقيقه انا بفصل يعني انا بفصل بين علاقتي بمتعه الادب وبين ما يحصل حاليا الان.
Because I usually try to separate between my relationship with literature and with what is going on currently.
يعني أنا أذكر مثلا إنه بالنسبة لي الأدب الروسي كان من الأدبيات اللي نشأت عليها، يعني تشيكوف، تولستوي مثلا.
I remember that the Russian literature is what I was reading when I was growing up. And that was my introduction to literature.
بس في اللحظة اللي كان الطائرات الروسية عم تقصف مدينة حلب، أنا ما عندي جواب لهي العلاقة بين الشيء اللي بيخص الأمة الوطنية الروسية وبين وطنيتي السورية. هذا شيء مختلف تماماً.
But when the Russian planes were bombing Aleppo, the Syrian city in the north, I did not have a clear vision of the relationship between the Russian literature, Russian nationalism, and my nationalism, my feeling of being Syrian.
Actually, أنا ضد اللوجيك تبع الربط، ضد اللوجيك تبع السؤال هذا، ضد المنطق تبع هذا السؤال. ما فيني أربط بيناتهم، ما فيني جاوب عليه.
In fact, I am against this kind of relation, the logic of tying the literature with the war or relating those two together, the two topics.
رغم انه روسيا تحتل قسم من بلدي الان، وبوتين انا بعتبره مجرم حرب.
Despite the fact that Russia occupies part of Syria right now, and I consider Vladimir Putin as a war criminal.
بس الحديث عن الجواب عن هذا السؤال تحديدا أنا بعتقد بيحتاج لتأمل أكبر، وما عندي جواب كامل له.
But figuring out this relationship between the literature and the people who are conducting these wars requires a more in-depth evaluation about this relationship, and I do not have an answer for if the relationship has changed over the war.
Sure. I mean, it's a complicated. Well, it's. I think for those who are not in situation of Ukrainians, for example, who have this very kind of intertwined relationship where even Russians try to claim many Ukrainian artists as their own under the Soviet umbrella. It's a bit more complicated, I think, in terms of how Ukrainians experience, how the Middle East, how countries of Middle East and how Eastern Europeans experience it, because and I think in this sense that Ukrainian writers are doing very important work to show how this literature influences the culture, because I mean,
of course, but of course I agree with you, but يعني أنا ما بقدر نحن ككتاب أنا بعتقد إنه المفترض يكون عندنا هذا الالتزام يعني لما بلشت الحرب على أوكرانيا أنا كأنه استعدت كل ما حصل في سوريا. بفهم إنه أكون ملتزمة، بس أنا كنت ضد مقاطعة تدريس دوستويفسكي بالجامعات اللي دعوا إليها بعض الجامعات في العالم.
I agree with you, but when the war in Ukraine started, I was against people who were calling on banning Dostoevsky teaching in universities. I separated these two issues.
Well, in terms of this, I mean, we can go forever. We can spend the
Kate,
whole hour.
let me jump in here and maybe switch the focus a bit. I mean, I do want to say that I agree, Samar, that it is a really complicated and rich question that I don't think we could we could focus the whole conversation around it, as I think Kate was going to suggest. I'm the child of refugees, and I grew up with the parents who would not allow Russian books to be in the house. I, however, did fall in love with the work of Dostoevsky, and loved a lot of Tolstoy and a lot of Mandelstam and a lot of Russian poetry. And it's when we walk into a museum and look at a painting of Caravaggio's, we're not immediately aware that he was also a murderer. So the kind of our aesthetic responses and our kind of political awareness of the context out of which books grow, it certainly enriches our response and is its own kind of subject for a conversation. I think there's so much American literature that if you read it through with a heightened awareness of its homophobia, its racism, you would want to put aside, except that you do have some attachment perhaps to an earlier encounter with it before your consciousness was raised. So it's complicated, but I do want to shift a bit, because Samar, I remember that when we first met, you don't remember this, but the first question you asked was, are they still writing about us? It was about newspaper coverage of the war. And this is a kind of key moment right now, 100 days into this war, and suddenly Ukraine is no longer the banner headline in newspapers around the world, certainly not in the United States. And I wonder if you and then others could weigh in to what, how much was that, how important was that coverage? It was very important to you at the time. In retrospect, looking back, did you feel that newspaper coverage did much of anything? What was its role in the war in Syria? And then I'd love to hear from Oksana and Aleksandar how you are sort of observing and seeing the kind of news cycle go, because there is a certain sense of urgency that you don't want the world to push this aside, and yet you fear that it is inevitably happening because people's attention span moves on. So Samar, if you could begin by saying something about that.
Thank you very much. Really, it's very important what you said now. And أنا الحقيقة عندي شعور إنه في العالم الجديد اللي نعيش فيه، أتحدث عن سوريا أولاً. لأتحدث عن سوريا، العالم الجديد عنيف وسريع جداً لدرجة إنه التراجيديا السورية محيت تماماً الآن. Hello?
Rafi?
Anyone can
Okay.
translate it?
Yes, I will translate. I thought, you're still going. I feel like I should start talking about what's going on in Syria. In the new world that we live in, this world is very fast and very violent, and people have very short attention span, and they tend to erase what happened yesterday so that they can grasp more information or keep up. So there is erasing going on. They don't keep up with what is going on. And that's, I believe, an indication of violence. And
يعني أنا
Yes,
بس أنا أذكر تماماً في السنوات الأولى من الحرب السورية إنه كثير من الكتاب في العالم وقفوا معنا في قضايانا والصحفيين وكتبوا عن الحرب السورية. كانت في السنوات الأولى.
You're muted, Rafi.
Oh, sorry. And in the very first few years, I recall that many authors and news reporters stood by us as Syrians, and they reported and they covered what we were doing.
بس أنا بعتقد بعد الثورة الرقمية حالياً الصورة العنيفة والمتسارعة للحرب السورية وبدء حروب أخرى جعل كأن هذه الحرب لم تكن موجودة.
But after the digital revolution and the fast pace of the images and videos coming out of the war, and the start of other wars around the world, made the Syria war as if it never existed.
بس هذا ما بيعني ابدا انه انا اشعر بالرضا انه تم تغطية التراجيديا السورية بما يكفي. انا اذكر اني كنت غاضبة من نعومة شومسكي لما حلل بما يخص الوضع السوري انه ما يحصل هو مؤامرة كبرى مثلا.
But that doesn't mean that I'm happy and satisfied about how the war in Syria was covered. No, I remember being very angry at Noam Chomsky when he described what was going on in Syria as a global conspiracy theory.
We are all angry at Noam Chomsky, Samar.
بيتفقوا معك بالرأي حول اليوم.
Yes, I understand, but really انه الان بعد 10 سنوات والعالم صمت تماما بالحديث عن سوريا. انا اشعر مثل كانه جميعنا نحن السوريين عايشين في مقبره، مسكرين علينا الباب كلنا، ما عاد حدا بده يسمع بالتراجيديا السوريه.
After 10 years of the Syrian tragedy, I feel that me and other Syrians, all Syrians are living like in some kind of a cemetery where we're blocked and there is black over us so that no one can hear about Syria or does hear about Syria anymore.
I think it's very horrible to hear this, especially as we are going through this conflict in Ukraine and we don't know when it will end. But I just want to say before Oksana and Aleksandar chime in, that one of the most touching things for me watching the relation between Syria and Ukraine is that Syrian doctors, there was my friend Olga Topolyuk reported on this. Syrian doctors were teaching Ukrainian doctors how to treat patients of chemical attacks. And I did some.
We have the same enemy.
Yeah.
We have the same enemy.
Yeah, sadly. And I did some reporting on the Cancer Institute in Kyiv. And the head doctor was saying they were looking to Syria, to Afghanistan, to understand how doctors there were helping or trying to help patients during wartime, because people still get sick. You still have to save lives, not only from bombs. And so it's very, I hope that this relationship between Syria and Ukraine can develop in the coming years even more. Oksana, Oksana, Aleksandar, I'm interested to hear what you think on this topic that Askold brought up.
Well, I do want to say that the diminishment of coverage, it's not just I think it's too simple, and I'm not saying that Askold is suggesting this, that to think that, reporters report because the news, at some point people lose the interest and the reporters switch to reporting on something else. I think that the diminishment coverage at least is partly due to two things, and one is that there's a large number of Western governments who do not want to get involved, and it suits them to lessen the coverage, right? That's a particular case in Europe and here too. And the other thing is, even within those Western political arenas, but also because of, what's taking place in Syria and in Ukraine is genocide. There's an army of genocide deniers, kind of spontaneous ones like Chomsky, but also bots and propagandists whose purpose is not, it would be too easy and too simple if they just talked everyone saying nothing happened, because we can see that a lot of things happen. But the way they go about establishing foundations of future denial is filling up the space with complications until the public thinks, oh, it's too complicated, we cannot understand it, right? And this is where the interest of bots and governments might meet, right? In Germany now they're saying, oh, Ukraine, it's corrupt, people are not really represented, it's too complicated, let's not get involved. When in the 90s, when there were two simultaneous instances of genocide taking place, in Bosnia and Rwanda in 94, you had front pages of newspapers, two simultaneous genocides. They were repeating the same phrases. I remember reading this. Thousands of years of hatred. Let's not get involved. it is not that the amount of information is diminished in reporting. It is that there's a lot of noise and deliberate white noise to obscure the essence of the situation. In this particular case, to my mind, it's genocide. What is taking place in Ukraine is genocide, planned, organized, strategically and ideologically in Syria too, in Bosnia too. And so that's too much for, it's not that it's too much for people to bear and they don't want to read about it. It is that it's, you know, if we acknowledge genocide, this is certainly the case with Rwanda and Bosnia, then we would have to do something about it because, you know, never again. And so it's not genocide, it's complicated, it's just war. War happens, bad things happen. Who's right in this conflict? Both sides, American imperialism, blah, 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 blah. And then people switch to Johnny Depp and what's her name? I forgot now.
Amber Heard.
Right.
Yes, I agree.
You're right. I agree
Tout
too.
à fait. I agree. It's
Sure.
it's really what's going on now. It's really.
And just before Oksana chimes in, I mean, if we talk about Bosnia, I think Aleksandar would agree. I mean, even how many years later, there's still people trying to obscure the truth when it's been a long time. Evidence is clear. There's so many war criminals who were sent to The Hague. And you have great activists from Bosnia who are trying to warn against future provocations in the region that can lead to conflict again. And people try to silence them and they try to distort memory. I mean, when Peter Handke won the Nobel Prize for Literature and people didn't understand why this was such an outrage for Bosnians and people who sympathized with Bosnians. So even after war ends, the work of activists and writers and journalists, it's a lifetime, I think.
Yes, actually, I agree with everyone, and I do agree with the term genocide, which this is exactly what's happening. And it's amazing how many articles did appear in press. Some of them trying to obscure the truth, or perhaps just not understanding the truth, but many actually revealing the truth. So I saw that as a hope, some sort of hope at least. I know that some of my peers have worked tirelessly trying to educate everyone, like for example, Oksana Zabushko, and other people as well. And it's disappointing that oftentimes Western intellectuals just either don't know what's going on or don't want to know what's going on. I also remember this the piece by Chomsky and some of the responses that it generated. As for, and the same for this discourse of fatigue, you know, the kind of the West getting tired of things and people getting tired of war, and then everybody is told that, you know, maybe it's time. And I just received a letter yesterday from a very dear friend who for some reason tells me that, you know, maybe we should just give up the territory, and no land is worth people's deaths. And so you see this discourse of let's just end it, it eventually penetrates everywhere. It just comes into the very country affected by it as well. So it never just stays, you know, that just shows us how much power words actually have, you know, and how much power words that the goal of which is to obscure the truth would have. So I find that quite disturbing, actually. And like I said, I do feel that this time around Ukrainians did speak for themselves quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Kate, I've got one more question I want to follow up with. So all three of you are now living, I don't know whether it's in exile or immigration, I'm sure it's different in each case, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit about your relationship to your original homes now, and maybe there's wisdom you could share with each other, as I'm sure that relationship has evolved as time has gone on.
It's a very difficult question. أنا الحقيقة بعده راسي بسوريا، يعني أنا المنفى بالنسبة إلي صار بعتقد تغير مفهوم المنفى، لأنه أنا بعده راسي بسوريا بشكل يومي؟
For me, the being in exile has changed. The concept has changed. My head is still in Syria. My head is still in Syria on daily basis.
يعني وخاصة انه نحن بنشتغل كشبكة فيمينست، بنشتغل مع النساء بالداخل السوري وبالمخيمات وبدول المنن، فنحن كل يوم كأنه أنا عايشة بسوريا، ما عندي إحساس إنه خرجت منها، جسدي برا بس كلني بداخل، يعني بعدني موجودة بهداك المكان، أنا بعدني بهديك اللحظة اللي اسمها لحظة الثورة ب 2011، بعدني ما طلعت منها.
I am still at that moment of when the revolution started in 2011, as if I have never left. Physically, my body is not in Syria, but mentally I'm there. I am active with a group of feminist networks working with women inside Syria, in the camps and outside Syria. That's why I don't feel that I have ever left.
and يعني بعدني عم بكتب، يعني بعدني عم طلع الكتب عم توثيقية ولا روائية عن سوريا، بعدني ما بقدر حتى أحكي إلا بالعربي، فراسي كله ما في أي تغيير.
And I'm still writing. I'm still writing documentary style or novels, but I can't even speak. Don't want to speak in English. I prefer to speak in Arabic.
I refuse to speak in French or English. Just I want to speak in Arabic. I want to stay in my home with, across my language. That is.
Understood. Absolutely beautiful. Yeah. No, of course. Yeah, so I don't know, Oksana, Aleksandar, both of you have been out for a while. I know I just noticed also in our audience, Mart is there, so Belarus is obviously part of this whole kind of conundrum and conversation. But yeah, Oksana, Aleksandar, I'd love to know over time what your relationship, how that has evolved and changed.
Well, I think I'm close to the point of view that that Samar just spoken about. I also feel like I'm still part of Ukraine and everything in me belongs to Ukraine. And I do think that, at least for my generation, it has been eased quite a bit by the development of technology, when you can pick up the phone or Zoom or whatnot, and you can be there. I believe it was much harder for people of other generations, and especially during when Soviet Union stood, there was kind of like you could never reach anybody inside there. So if you were Ukrainian and your country doesn't exist as a separate sovereign entity, that would be an issue. I do teach at the university here in Texas, and it's the Slavic department. So again, even my professional life more or less revolves around the Slavic world. And yet I wouldn't claim that I have experienced the war, because I have only watched it from the distance.
Well, I've lived now in the United States longer than I've lived in my previous life in Sarajevo. So now 30 years in the United States. And I was 27 when I moved here, or when I ended up here. And what I can tell you from my experience is that, and Samar already knows it, is it never goes away. It's that the central event of my life, even after all these years here, is the war. And everything attains meaning in relation to it. And that's complicated in a country where, you know, there are a lot of people, which is not a bad thing, who do not relate to a war as the central event of their life. There are a lot who do, and which is why we are talking here as in terms of solidarity. But it is this mismatch, so that I never fully feel that I'm entirely here and I'm not entirely there either. And this is not just having dual identities or complex identities. It is a kind of stacked organization of reality, a reality in which war is a central fact, and a reality in which war is not a central fact. And for whatever reason, particularly in the past couple of years, I'm more, partly because I missed Sarajevo and Bosnia because of the pandemic, I couldn't go. I just came back last week. My instinct was turned toward the people with whom I shared that experience, because I assumed that they would understand what's going on in this country, sort of the societal collapse. And when Ukraine started, it wasn't really hard because we constantly touched my Bosnian Sarajevan friends. We could read the situation from lives in which war, our Bosnian war, is the central fact of our lives, and which is why I have this compulsion lately to work with Bosnians rather than do things in Bosnia with the Bosnian artists, the Bosnian writers published there more than here. And I don't know, I don't know if that benefits Bosnia in any way. The point is that somehow the war in Ukraine and the happenings in this country in the past few years made me more oriented now than 10 years before toward my Bosnian experience, toward my Bosnian friends, toward Bosnian culture in general, because somehow it seems to me that it understands the world better than American culture now. This could be entirely, symptomatic on my part. I would not make a large claim or write an essay or book claiming that we know better. But it's just a feeling that I have. The connection is so strong after 30 years with all my friends who went to and people, not even friends, who have gone through the same thing.
Yeah, no, of course. I think that the hard truth to get across to people who have not experienced this, and again, I have not experienced it directly, but it remained the central fact of my parents' lives for their 50 years that they spent living in this country after leaving Ukraine in their late 20s, is that the effects of a war last for generations. I think that this is something that trauma studies have made abundantly clear to us. But the singular experience of war, as opposed to other kinds of traumas, has got its own demons and its own processes that are complicated to explain to those who have no context for it, really, to understand it. No, I agree. Kate, do you want to open up to some questions or observations from the audience?
Just to kind of close on this topic of war always living with you, I did a kind of interview series with ordinary Ukrainians about the air raid siren, from eastern Ukraine or west all the way to the east of Ukraine, because it's very different scenarios when people experience the air raid siren. When I hear it, it's they have shot down missiles over Chernivtsi. We have good defense, but the way we hear it, it's not the same as people in Kharkiv or Kramatorsk hear it. And it was very interesting. A colleague of mine, Katarina Yakovilenko, she's a very great scholar. She said she was in Irpin when the war started, and this Irpin, Bucha, Hostomel, this area saw absolute horrors. And she said even hearing the rolling of the wheels of a suitcase reminds her of the sounds of the fighter jets now. So, this sounds of war even follow you in peacetime. And it's, like you said, a lot of studies have been done on it, and it's very, we can talk about it forever. So yeah, please, everyone in the audience, we welcome some questions at this time. You can write them in the chat, let us know. As we are waiting for questions, I'm just wondering if the three of you let's be romantic for a second and talk about the power of literature. How do you think writers can forge this kind of solidarity between people, suffering peoples, breaking free of suffering going forward? How can Syrian, Bosnian, and Ukrainian writers remain in conversation going forward?
You can write some text together.
Yeah, probably. Okay, maybe you guys are shy in the audience. If you want, feel free.
No, I can say it. Literature has limited reach. Obviously, we all know this because we do it, and so it does not change the world. It doesn't stop wars. It doesn't save lives. And a surgeon is probably, in certain contexts, more valuable of the presence of a surgeon than the presence of a writer. Mm. I do think that literature contains a vast amount of human experience that is not organized around hierarchies that are part of that kind of inherent in history, usually, or commonly rather, or hierarchies that a military operation requires. In other words, what quickly happens, or might set in, is that awareness that what I or we are living through right now might be forgotten. It might be forgotten in its particularities, the sound of the, suitcase wheels on the pavement. They might come when no one will lament in the war, right? And that, to me, my writerly instinct demands that be written down. Not the big picture. I mean, the big picture too, but the big picture will be covered. The news, the media, the historians, the politicians, there'll be data that will be put somewhere, and we will be able to reconstruct, hopefully, what happened. But what is vanishing daily are lives of people, I mean, biological, physical lives. And each of those lives is a multitude of details, right? Each life contains multitudes of experiences, and literature can host those. Not all of them, not every single person, but to me, there's this inherent potential of literature to be democratic in terms of experience. And this is one of the great books of the Sarajevo siege. Was written by my friend Samar Yazbek, Sarajevo Blues. It is poetry and prose, a very small book. And to me, it contains so much experience. I was not under siege, so what I know about the siege, as it were, in human terms, much of it I learned from this book, because it contains details like the sound of wheels of a suitcase, right? There's a moment where there's a shelling outside, and the cat that sleeps on his chest flexes her paw, or rather her talons, right?
Yeah.
And this tactile moment, it just brought the shelling somehow into my body. And this kind of thing, the work never ends. But none of that work will ever liberate a country, strictly speaking, or will win a war, or will kill a Russian general, right? Which I prefer to a poem at this time. And so it is sort of hopeful utopian to engage with literature and put this experience into it, hoping that one day people will know, or people tomorrow will know, who are not directly related to that experience.
Yeah, I mean, you make a great point.
انا بس بدي اضيف نقطه، بوافق الكسندر كثير. بدي اضيف نقطه انه اهميه الادب، غير انه بيعطي معنى، انه الادب دائما ينظر لعداله ما ممكنه في المستقبل. في جزء من هذا الشيء بيعمله الادب يعني.
I would like to add a point. I agree with what Aleksandar was saying. I'd like to add the point that literature has the power to achieve justice somehow, somewhere. You can achieve that in literature.
Yeah, one of the greatest examples of that, I think, is Svetlana Drakulic, Croatian writer, and she wrote this great book, They Would Never Hurt a Fly, about the war criminals during the Bosnian genocides. And it was one of the most formative texts for me, I think, as a student learning about this conflict. We have a question in the audience. I guess this is more geared towards Oksana, maybe. Tatiana, I guess, she says, thank you for such a deep and honest conversation. What do you think, which literary genre will be the most useful for Ukrainian writers to explore the future of the war? Will it be a great tome novel, or poetry, or some kind of therapeutic drama, nonfiction? What do you think?
Okay, yeah, I can answer, and kind of revisiting the previous question, I do feel that literature is in some ways constructing future. It might be, like Aleksandar suggested, the immediate future only, and yet it still does. And many in Ukraine now say that we are able to resist the Russian troops because we had the writers of the 1930s and we actually read them. Because of the time after the Soviet Union, that all those banned voices were at least somewhat returned, at least to some people. As for reflecting the war, I think it's depends on the timeline that we take. The snapshots would probably be, the documentary probably be the first response, maybe some poetry as well, and sick novels come usually later. So all of these genres are important. And again, I'm also not really prone to seeing writers as magical figures. So there's limitations to what they do, and yet all of these genres genres can have a place, can be important, can reflect something, but whether they altogether reflect the very core of a thing, I mean, that's a big question that we're probably not going to be able to solve at this point. And yet what I see now is, again, that documentary prose and poetry, and there's quite a lot of this in Ukraine now, and I wouldn't expect a big novel about this war immediately.
Sure, sure. Anyone else in the audience has any questions you would like to ask?
Can I just add something to what
Sure.
Oksana said?
Sure.
I think obviously there are already existing forms, there will be default forms for people to engage with the experience of war. But I also think that given that the structure of reality is changing, or the reality even one could say is being destroyed, there will be new forms. And I don't necessarily mean just literary forms. There will be hybrid forms, there will feature literature and music and so on, because the operation of Ukrainian culture, as it were, it doesn't have to be sorted out into forms or even arts, right? There will be this need to speak, to regain agency, to to construct a culture after the war, and to work at that. And ideally, there will be a multitude of voices rather than the one wise man who will write a great novel about the war in Ukraine. There should be, and there will be many, many voices. And I also mean singing. Based on my family, there'll be songs about this war for generations.
There's already songs.
That's a great point, actually. Yes, and I think we have these genres now, like video poetry and stuff like that.
Yeah. We have another question from Heather Fielding. So she asks all three of you, do you have any advice for people who have never had any experience with this kind of trauma, be it directly or through family, friends, how to be good, sensitive readers of literature coming out of these recent and current wars going forward? So how to be intelligent readers about conflict?
Probably the toughest question of all.
Yeah, very difficult question.
You know, one likes to believe that literature does change individuals, perhaps not nation. You know, I like to quote that line of Tesla Milish's: "What is poetry that does not save nations or people? A connivance with official lies, a song for drunkards whose throats will be slit in a moment." You know, there is that high hope that literature can change consciousness, and we do believe that it changes it at the individual level. And I think that is when that change is really extreme, those who have fallen under its spell become writers. But even short of becoming writers, those who read, who know how to read, who read sensitively, who read carefully, are enlarged and transformed by it. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw this question. Yeah, like Askold said, it's about being readers in general. It's like how do you become a reader? How do you become a good reader of pretty much anything? And in today's world, there's so much information out there that I guess selecting sources would be necessary, and yeah, relying on some opinions of those you trust could also work, but it's hard. And I don't know if I would single out the literature about war and conflict as a separate category that requires a certain type of reader, but just the reader that is used to being a reader, which is progressively difficult in the world of snippets and social media. And I myself find myself, you know, wondering maybe I should just scroll through something short rather than sit through something long. So this basically working on lengthening one's attention span, which is one hell of a task.
Concentration is prayer.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, everyone reads differently, and also everyone becomes a reader in a different way and sensitized to some texts over others. So I do think that there is a value in, for the lack of a better term, a kind of ethical reading, right? Understanding what the ethical value of events, structure, characters, and the decisions, language might be. And of course, ethical is adjacent to political. And so what we were talking about earlier, right? I would never think that Chekhov or Russian writers should be banned from schools anywhere else. But I do think that Russian writers and all other writers in different times and different places and different contexts should be read critically, right? One could enjoy Chekhov and also see the strong traces of Russian imperialism in there, or even enjoy finding those traces, because it is an act of intellectual discovery and it has an ethical value, right? And the kind of reading that is for entertainment, which is how we are really trained to read here from an early age, is not applicable to literature that comes from such a historically intense context, right? Because it's not entertaining. Genocide is not entertaining. I taught a class to students some years ago called War, Violence, and Suffering, and discovered there's a ceiling of interest that, Tadeusz Borowski, This Way to the Gas Chamber, ladies and gentlemen, they did not enjoy that. They should not have enjoyed it, right? But also they had hard, because they were in school, so they ended up okay probably. But they could not connect with it because they were trained to be entertained and enjoy stuff. What do you do with a book that is not enjoyable because it's so full of difficult ethical questions, not to mention suffering?
Yeah, no, that's an essential observation.
I think Lutsyshyna has a question, yes?
Yes. Is it me?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this conversation. I feel so lucky to listen to you, writers I love so much. And I'm sorry I started writing my question in the chat, but I also wanted to listen to you. And so it was very hard to do both at the same time. And so my question it's an intimate question. And it starts with what Aleksandar said about poems that cannot kill generals, unfortunately. And I want to ask about things that poems can do, which is that in these moments of crisis, years of crisis, months of crisis, days of crisis, a poem can speak to somebody and be that voice that is very important to hear. And I wonder, and this is why my question is very intimate, I wonder, what is that voice for you today in this year, in these months of genocide? Who do you read as a reader, not as a writer at all, not as a writer thinking of literature, but as somebody who needs literature as a human being to live, yeah. And so who do you go to intimately as a reader? Askold quoted Czesław Miłosz, and this is somebody who I have been reading the whole time because Miłosz insists on praise, right? Or he's counting the blessings, even though this is the account of somebody who has lost so much, his country, his friends, his history. So this is the praise of somebody who knows what loss is. And today I met with a friend from Belarus, and she said that she's reading Svetlana Alexievich, who she was never able to read before. This is speaking of that kind of journalistic documentary writing that has a very strong tradition in Belarusian literature. And so I was shocked that in this time of crisis, she's also reading these books that are kind of unreadable, right? Because they do not take care of their reader at all. They harm you, and you feel like you need to somehow cleanse yourself after them. So unlike Miłosz, who I feel always cleanses me with focusing on the grace and on the beauty, I wonder who is your writer today that you go to intimately as a reader? Maybe you do not want to say, because I want a really intimate answer. who is that person who tells you exactly what you need to hear, even though you didn't know you needed to hear exactly those words when you picked up the book?
Well, I don't know if I have one writer to return to, because There's so many things that are happening as a lot of I do know that, and this hasn't just started with the war in Ukraine, but I've been reading a lot more poetry, and I've always read poetry in the past couple of years. And I can't quite define why that is. I have less tolerance for bad narratives. I'd rather try a poem, and not because it's short, but because there's something different at stake. And this is just propositional. I can't claim that I fully figured this out. I think that a situation which the history and reality is coming apart, and paradoxically gives greater value to language. That is, we need to reassess and reevaluate language. How am I going to talk about this to someone? And I don't mean just write, I mean talk about this. What are the words? And of course, we're always being fed the words that everyone is using, whether it's on social media, newspapers, editorials. But we instinctively, we as humans, but also we as writers, instinctively know there's something extremely particular to this experience, this moment, at this time, in this place in history, for which we need language. And I would think that, for instance, in Ukraine, where language is, the erasure of language is part of the genocidal intent on the Russian part, that language has enormous value, enormous importance, that it's important to write in Ukrainian, whatever, but also that in some ways that poetry contains the greatest amount of language per the smallest vessel, right? You can have a lot of language in one short poem. And so I think this is what turned me toward poetry. Other than that, I've been reading a lot of books about pre-war intellectuals in Germany and Austria, like Central European intellectuals before the Nazis. Somehow it seems appropriate to look into that.
I agree about poetry being this highest form of concentration of language. I always saw it as a sort of an incantation, almost like a kind of like a formula that a priest or a magician may utter. And in that sense, it has been extremely important for me to be reading poetry with others. I've participated in several poetry readings, and each time I find myself just kind of falling through into somebody else's poem or set of poems and kind of inhabiting it for a while. And it's a feeling that nothing really compares, that doesn't really compare to anything much, not even to the reading of prose. And I've just did a reading with some Ukrainian writers for University of Victoria over Zoom, and Luba Yakimchuk, whom I've heard many times. She's a Ukrainian poet, contemporary, and I've heard all these poems before, and I have read all these poems before, and yet now they sound different because of the war. And there was a particularly strong poem about how there's lots of graves and all these people died of old age, which kind of speaks to this, denial of everything. It's like, no, it's not the Russian army killing people. They just died of old age. And what the poem is basically speaking out the names of these people and the years of their life and death, which is, they could not have died of old age because they're totally not old, and some of them are children. And the next person reading was Boris Khersonsky, who read his Ukrainian texts, and they were also very strong and somehow struck me. And it happens pretty much with every person reading, that somehow it's as if poetry is this beautiful castle that even though I write poetry, I often admire from the outside still. It's like I see how it's constructed, I see the windows, I see the doors, I see the roof, it looks beautiful. But it's not, even I cannot say that every time I read a poem, I am inside it. And somehow it happens that in all these readings, the energy was such that I was inside it. And some poetry readings that I participated in, people read in English, and those would be American poets, and it would also be the same. And then I had the privilege of translating one poem by Caroline Fortune. It was incredible. It was basically about the invasion of the Russian army and what can words do to stop the tanks. So it literally speaks to this question of, can a poem kill a Russian general? And it's affected me for weeks.
Samar, are you a poetry reader?
You're muted, Samar. We can open your microphone. Nice.
Let's see, did she disappear?
Maybe.
I think so. I think some technology.
I was just going to say that, because the name Yubayakinchuk came up, I'd had a conversation with her the other day that is posted on Agni online. And we spoke about this very kind of question about how I too have been reading a lot more poetry lately. And it's in part because there's a suppleness to it, its ability to respond to changing realities, its ability to discover a form for the moment and for the experience, its ability to focus on essences. All those sort of qualities give us a kind of heart and mind connection that is urgent, immediate, and somehow also consoling, because I think that it breaks down that kind of barrier between self and other somehow. I think that's what every great work of art does. Indeed, it breaks down that barrier and one feels less alone in that connection. I think that's the experience of connection that you're describing, Oksana, as people open up to each other in that very intimate way. So Valzhina, your question is indeed an intimate one because it is about an intimate experience. I have to say that the other thing that I have picked up lately that I have found some comfort in is Plato's Republic, with all of its many problems. But there is something about just the kind of honesty of that quest that is part also of humanity and everybody's capacity to ask questions and not be satisfied with easy answers is inherent to that text.
And also Paul Celan, I think that's a go-to for everyone. I mean, I'm in Chernivtsi, I have to hype him always. When you read his work, you kind of understand this phrase that Adorno said, that poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. You understand it in a new way. I believe Adorno was even kind of referring to Celan, who broke the language and restructured it, and that he was writing in German, this language which was very painful for him because it is the language of the country that brought the death of his parents. When he was a multilingual person, he spoke many, many languages, but he chose to write in German, even though he once wrote poems in Romanian too. And the way he explores this survivor's guilt, how to understand the loss of his parents, everything that led to that point. I mean, Celan always gives strength. So I encourage anyone who hasn't read his work to check it out. I wrote Samar. I hope she can be able to come back. I don't know if she lost the internet connection. Does anyone else from the audience have any questions before we wrap up? Oh, well, everyone, I thank both the audience and participants for joining together tonight. Tonight, it's tonight in Ukraine. I really, I don't know if you heard before I muted, we did have an air raid siren. So I have to kind of wrap up and head to the basement. And I really, I think the conversation we had was quite impactful, and yet we were only touching the surface. We could go on for several hours with this conversation in all different directions. And I really, I want to end by mentioning something that one poet, Ukrainian poet, Yarina Chornohuz, she's combat medic on the front lines in Donbass. We published an interview with her on Epiphany yesterday. And she had a lot of great lines in this interview, but the greatest one for me was everything that exists in the Ukrainian language prepared Ukrainians for this moment, to give them the strength to survive these moments and process their emotions. So even though poems cannot kill Russian generals, I do believe that I have some romanticism, some hope that, you know, these languages, this literature guides us through everything. And I'm getting emotional. I appreciate all the support for Ukraine. I stand with not just with Ukrainians, but with Bosnians, Syrians, everyone that has suffered. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Amen.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye.
Next time.